For 14 straight years, we've basically lived under this one unquestioned rule in the real estate market.
Right. The idea that home prices only go up.
Exactly. I mean, you might see a plateau or maybe a slight cooling of bidding wars, but the baseline assumption has always been that your home value is just this one-way escalator. But in February 2026, that rule actually officially broke.
It did. We saw a year-over-year home price decline of 0.2%, which, is the first annual drop we've had since 2012.
And that fundamentally alters the psychology of anyone navigating the housing landscape right now. We are dealing with an environment that isn't just correcting, it is actively squeezing households in ways we really haven't seen in modern economic history.
Yeah, totally. It's a massive squeeze.
So welcome to today's deep dive for April 12, 2026. What we are setting up for you today is essentially a split screen monitor. On the left side of your screen, you've got this unprecedented financial volatility. I'm talking interest rates, import tariffs, a completely frozen Federal Reserve, and a housing market defying basic economic models.
And on the right side of the screen.
On the right side, you have your own nervous system, your gut microbiome, and the bleeding edge of 2026 longevity science. Because our mission today is to completely erase the dividing line between those two screens.
I love that framing because you really are absorbing the macroeconomic environment on a cellular level.
Right. We are taking the hard mortgage data, along with some insights from the book, One Reason to Not Get a Reverse Mortgage, and we are mapping it all directly onto cellular biology because your financial environment and your physical health span are not running on separate tracks. They are colliding.
They absolutely are. The current data makes it basically impossible to optimize your physical longevity without addressing the chronic external strain of this specific economy.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the biological fallout, we have to kind of forensically examine the stressor itself. Let's look at the financial gauntlet you are standing in right now.
It's a tough one.
It really is. Mortgage rates are easing just a tiny fraction this week after a brutal 5-week surge. Zillow has the 30-year fix sitting around 6.15%, and the Freddie Mac's weekly average is higher at 6.37%.
Yeah, and the 15-year fix is hovering around 5.64%.
Right. And those numbers feel incredibly heavy to a market that was conditioned for years to expect rates in the 3s and 4s.
Without a doubt. And the ceiling on those rates is locked in place by the Federal Reserve, which is currently paralyzed. They're in this very cautious wait-and-see mode. They literally just held their benchmark rate steady at 3.5 to 3.75%.
Because inflation refuses to die. We've got core PCE inflation projected at 2.7%, which is stubbornly above the Fed's 2% target.
Exactly. And when you look at the FOMC members, the folks actually voting on these rate cuts, they're looking at a landscape where oil prices have spiked over 40% since March.
Wow, 40%. That's massive.
It is. The geopolitical situation is driving energy costs through the roof, and the mechanics of that are what trap the Fed. Well, core PCE intentionally strips out volatile food and energy prices to find the underlying inflation trend. But when energy spikes 40%, it eventually bleeds into the cost of manufacturing and transporting every single good in the economy.
So it catches up to the core numbers eventually.
Right. The FOMC members know that 40% oil spike will inevitably drag core inflation higher down the line. They just cannot risk cutting rates and flooding the market with cheaper borrowing money when that energy-driven inflation wave is already cresting.
Which means the market entered 2026 hoping for rate relief, and instead the horizon just keeps receding. And that tension brings us back to the February price drop, because I want to unpack this apparent contradiction.
The fact that prices are dropping even though inventory is low.
Exactly. We have a situation where rates are elevated, which normally crushes buyer demand. But we also have historically low inventory, which usually keeps prices aggressively high. Basic economics says low supply equals high prices, yet the prices are dropping.
It's totally counterintuitive.
It's like we've been watching this massive, high-stakes staring contest between exhausted buyers and stubborn sellers. The buyers are suffering from what the data calls affordability fatigue. They literally cannot qualify to borrow 2023 prices at 2026 interest rates.
So they just stop participating.
Right. And for the first time in 14 years, the sellers blinked.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the institutional forecasts reflect that exact gridlock. You've got S&P Global out there predicting robust mortgage issuance growth for 2026. They're banking on the idea that life events like marriages, Job relocations, downsizing will eventually force people to transact regardless of the rates.
But then Zillow is simultaneously cutting its entire 2026 housing market outlook.
Exactly. They see the affordability fatigue as a harder ceiling.
So if the big institutions can't agree on where the market is going, what is the actual signal you should be paying attention to? I mean, it's not the daily mortgage rate quote, right?
No, not at all. The true pulse of the mortgage market is the 10-year Treasury yield. It's currently sitting at 4.317%.
Wait, why the 10-year yield?
Well, lenders don't just pull mortgage rates out of thin air. When a bank issues a 30-year mortgage, they usually bundle it into a security and sell it to global investors. And those investors constantly compare the yield on those mortgage-backed securities to the ultimate safe haven, which is the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond.
Oh, because the average 30-year mortgage is usually paid off or refinanced within about 10 years anyway.
Exactly. The 10-year bond is the perfect duration match. So when global investors get spooked by inflation or geopolitical conflict, they dump bonds. That forces the Treasury yield up to attract buyers.
And the moment that Treasury yield spikes, your local mortgage lender has to immediately hike their 30-year rates. Otherwise, no one will buy their mortgage securities.
That is the exact mechanism. Your local housing affordability is tethered by an invisible string to global bond market anxiety.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the supply side? If buyers are this exhausted and sellers are finally being forced to drop prices, basic capitalist economics dictates that builders should be rushing into the void to construct cheaper, entry-level homes to capture all that sideline demand.
You would think so.
Right. Why is the landscape completely barren of new, affordable builds?
Because the construction industry is being suffocated by four distinct macro forces. We already touched on the first, geopolitical conflict driving energy and transportation costs. But the second force is massive tariff chaos.
Tariffs on imported materials, right?
Yeah. Tariffs on imported lumber, steel, and appliances are aggressively compounding the cost to build.
Let's trace that supply chain cascade, because a tariff on Canadian lumber or overseas steel isn't just absorbed by the builder.
Not a chance. The building material price growth has stayed above 3%. By the time you pour the foundation, frame the house, and install the appliances, the baseline cost to construct the home has mathematically eliminated the possibility of selling it at an affordable price point.
The affordable supply is constrained before a shovel even hits the dirt.
Exactly. And then you add the third force, which is a completely collapsed refinancing market.
Yeah.
The 30-year refi rate is currently at 6.78%.
Ouch!
Right. Anyone who locked in a 2 or 3% rate in 2020 or 2021 is mathematically trapped. Even if they want to downsize, abandoning a 2.8% mortgage to take on a 6.37% mortgage makes zero financial sense.
So they stay put, which chokes off the supply of existing homes.
And if they decide to just tap their home equity to renovate instead of moving, they run face first into the fourth force, the frozen Federal Reserve.
Because ALOC rates are directly tied to the Fed's benchmark.
Yep. Every quarter point the Fed cuts passes directly to home equity line of credit borrowers within 30 to 60 days. But because the Fed is terrified of that oil spike, ALOC rates are staying punishingly high.
You are squeezed from every conceivable angle. High rates to buy, exorbitant material costs to build, and prohibitive borrowing costs to access your own equity.
Which brings up a really crucial point for seniors right now. Because when older adults face this kind of affordability fatigue and trapped equity, they often start looking at alternative financial products.
Right, which perfectly ties into that third source we're covering today, the book One Reason to Not Get a Reverse Mortgage.
Yes, that book is incredibly relevant for April 2026. A lot of seniors and their advisors are looking at high inflation and elevated living costs, and they think, well, let's just do a reverse mortgage to access that trapped equity without a monthly payment.
But the book argues that's a trap, especially right now. Why is it so risky in this specific environment?
Because of the compounding interest in a high-rate environment. When interest rates are hovering around 6.5 to 7%, the borrowing costs of a reverse mortgage compound aggressively. It basically vaporizes the equity in the home at an accelerated rate.
So you're eating through your ultimate safety net much faster than you would have in 2021.
Exactly. And the book points out that if you deplete that equity, you lose your options for funding long-term care later in your healthspan. Trying to plan your financial life right now, especially if you're a senior trying to downsize or maintain your independence, is like trying to budget for a cross-country road trip while the price of gas, the daily rate for your rental car, and the toll booth fees are literally fluctuating every hour.
The lack of predictability creates this prolonged, inescapable friction.
And that friction transforms from a temporary psychological annoyance into a chronic physiological threat, which shifts us to the right side of our split screen.
Yes, here's where it gets really interesting. This is where we stop talking about your wallet and start talking about your cells. How does navigating a 6.37% mortgage rate, compounding tariffs, and deciding whether to avoid a reverse mortgage actually alter the human body?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the latest longevity research points to a massive paradigm shift in 2026. The medical community has moved entirely away from the superficial concept of anti-aging.
Thank goodness.
Right. And they've consolidated around healthspan. We now define healthspan through 4 pillars: strength and mobility, cognitive clarity, emotional resilience, and independence.
And for seniors specifically, financial decisions directly dictate the architecture of that independence. Where you live, the accessibility of your home, the quality of care you can secure, it all hinges on affordability.
But the biological connection goes so much deeper than just affording a better zip code.
Right. We have this terrible habit of siloing our stressors. Like, we treat a conversation with a loan officer about rising HELOC rates and a conversation with a doctor about systemic joint inflammation as entirely unrelated events.
But the reality is that chronic financial uncertainty accelerates biological aging at the cellular level.
Because of the stress response.
Exactly. When you are constantly calculating whether your household budget can absorb the next wave of inflation, or stressing over the compounding interest of a reverse mortgage, your amygdala, which is the threat detection center of the brain, fires continuously.
And the brain cannot distinguish between a modern financial threat and a primitive physical predator.
No, it can't. Whether a tiger's chasing you or your mortgage rate just spiked out of affordability, the physiological response is identical. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline.
If that happens once, the parasympathetic nervous system eventually kicks in, you calm down, and you recover. But the 2026 housing market doesn't allow for recovery.
Right. It is a state of chronic, unresolving tension. Your nervous system stays locked in a sympathetic fight or flight state.
Walk us through the exact biological pathway there. How does being locked in fight or flight physically degrade the body over time?
Well, when your amygdala perceives constant threat, it redirects resources away from long-term maintenance projects, things like digestion and cellular repair. It pushes all that energy toward immediate survival.
So blood flow is literally diverted away from your digestive tract.
Literally. Over months and years of financial anxiety, this chronic diversion degrades your gut lining. It alters your gut microbiome, which is the control center for systemic inflammation. And it gets worse. Elevated cortisol physically shrinks the hippocampus, which directly impairs your memory and cognitive clarity.
That is a devastating paradox. The mental stress of trying to time the housing market or manage a complex reverse mortgage to preserve your long-term independence, that stress is actively destroying the memory, cognitive clarity, and physical resilience you need to actually enjoy that independence.
The stress of the spreadsheet is robbing you of your health span.
Because the macro forces driving this, the global bond markets, the Federal Reserve, the international tariffs, are completely outside your control. The medical interventions being heavily prioritized in 2026 have turned aggressively inward.
Yes, nervous system regulation is now the absolute cornerstone of longevity medicine.
So how do you intervene biologically to protect your cells against a macroeconomic backdrop you can't change? The 2026 data outlines a multi-pronged protocol. The immediate tools for the nervous system are breathwork, somatic practices, and what researchers are classifying as simplifying major financial decisions.
This raises an important question about prioritization.
Wait, I'm struggling with this a bit. Categorizing putting my financial plans on autopilot in the exact same medical bucket as a physical therapy or a nutritional intervention sounds like a massive stretch. How is avoiding a complex real estate transaction or passing on a reverse mortgage an actual medical treatment?
It comes down to closing open loops in your nervous system.
Open loops.
Yeah. Every complex, volatile financial gamble you engage in, trying to perfectly time a home sale, constantly monitoring the 10-year Treasury yield, or taking on a reverse mortgage with compounding interest acts as an open psychological loop.
Oh,
It demands constant, low-grade vigilance from your threat detection systems.
I get that. So by simplifying your financial life, maybe staying in your current home and modifying it, instead of engaging in a bidding war at 6.37%, you actively signal safety to your brain.
Exactly. Or, going back to that book, choosing not to get a reverse mortgage. By avoiding that complex, high-stakes financial product, you close the loop. You stop the continuous drip of cortisol.
You downregulate the nervous system.
Yes, and the reduction in systemic inflammation from that sense of predictability is as tangible and biologically measurable as taking a targeted supplement.
That is wild. And the data also elevates social connection to the level of a clinical intervention. Strong community ties are now empirically shown to actively reduce systemic inflammation and extend life expectancy.
The mechanism there is fascinating. Positive social interaction releases oxytocin, which directly counteracts cortisol.
Okay, but when people experience severe affordability fatigue, the instinct is often to isolate, isn't it?
Yes, unfortunately. They pull back from social engagements because of the cost, or they feel shame about their financial constraints. And that isolation strips away one of their most potent biological shields against stress.
So, hanging out with your neighbors or joining a community group is not just a nice feel good activity, it is a literal biological buffer against the inflammation caused by 40% oil spikes and stagnant home prices.
Exactly. And that connects directly to the physical interventions for 2026.
Hmm.
We are looking at a massive pivot toward highly personalized nutrition, diets tailored to your specific gut microbiome, metabolic patterns, and hormonal cycles.
The insights heavily emphasize fermented foods, anti inflammatory herbs, stable blood sugar, and circadian eating.
Which all makes sense biologically. We trace the mechanism back. Fermented foods rebuild the gut microbiome that chronic stress degrades. It strengthens the gut-brain axis.
And circadian eating, aligning your meals with your body's natural daylight rhythms, removes internal digestive friction. That allows your body to focus on cellular repair instead of constantly processing food late at night.
But amidst all this sophisticated personalized data, the research is really unequivocal about the single most critical physical priority, particularly for seniors and aging adults trying to maintain their independence in this environment.
Protein intake and resistance training.
Yes, they remain the absolute most evidence-backed interventions for preserving muscle mass and cognitive function.
So wait, you want to survive a historically hostile housing market where prices are dropping but affordability is paralyzed. Go eat a high-protein meal and lift heavy weights. It sounds bizarrely simplistic.
It does sound simple, but the mechanics behind it are profound. In a high-stress state, cortisol floods your bloodstream with glucose. It is preparing your body to physically run or fight.
But if you're just sitting at your kitchen table worrying about construction tariffs or reverse mortgage rates.
Right, that unused glucose circulating in your blood causes immense inflammatory damage. But muscle tissue physically acts as a metabolic sink. It literally soaks up and burns that excess glucose.
So building muscle mass is basically building a larger sponge for the stress-induced blood sugar?
Precisely. And resistance training demands central nervous system adaptation. You are forcing your brain to coordinate complex motor patterns under a physical load, which neurochemically protects the cognitive clarity you are losing to the financial anxiety.
It builds the foundation of the strength and mobility pillar. You are physically armor plating your body against the corrosive effects of the macroeconomy.
You really are.
Well, let's draw the final through line here. We started on the left side of our split screen with an April 2026 housing market that is practically engineered to induce chronic stress. We've got Freddie Mac logging mortgage rates at 6.37%. The Federal Reserve is frozen at 3.5 to 3.75% because a 40% spike in oil threatens to drag core inflation higher.
And we saw how tariffs on imported materials are pushing construction costs up, effectively killing affordable new builds.
Right, and the result is the first annual home price decline since 2012, driven purely by buyers hitting an absolute wall of affordability fatigue. And for seniors, the temptation of a reverse mortgage in this environment is incredibly high, but mathematically devastating.
Then we took that macroeconomic reality and mapped it onto your cellular biology. We traced exactly how the brain's inability to distinguish between financial gridlock and physical danger locks you into a sympathetic state.
We saw how that cortisol cascade degrades your gut lining, spikes inflammation, and literally shrinks the areas of the brain responsible for memory.
But we also outlined the mechanisms for taking back control. You cannot manually force the 10-year Treasury yield down.
No, and you cannot repeal international lumber tariffs. But you can heavily invest in your own health span. By simplifying your financial strategies, like avoiding risky reverse mortgages, to close open loops in your nervous system. By using social connection to trigger oxytocin, and by utilizing resistance training as a metabolic sink for stress-induced glucose.
You construct an internal environment capable of withstanding the external chaos.
This requires a fundamental recalculation of what we consider a good investment right now.
It really does. The return on investment for perfectly timing the housing market or squeezing an extra fraction of a percent out of a complex real estate deal is completely negated if the stress of that transaction shaves years off your cognitive health.
Which leaves you with a fascinating and maybe slightly terrifying philosophical thread to pull on. We have established today just how deeply our cellular biology is tied to our macroeconomic environment. Financial friction causes biological decay. Yes.
But
as longevity technology becomes more advanced, more personalized, and inevitably more expensive over the next decade, we have to ask where this is leading. If maintaining your health span in a hostile economy requires specialized microbiome nutrition, customized somatic therapies, and high-quality proteins, are we rapidly approaching a future where your credit score and your net worth literally buy you an extra decade of cognitive clarity?
That's a profound thought.
If biology and economics are living in the exact same house, the ultimate luxury of the future might not be the house itself, but the biological time to actually live in it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, when the market gets loud and the spreadsheets get chaotic, optimizing your physical resilience is the most mathematically sound financial move you can make. Keep breathing, keep lifting, and we'll see you next time.